In this module, I want to explore our current thinking about how we manage insects and other pests. Notice that I didn't use control or exterminate the pests. We have now come to the realization that managing insect populations through many different techniques yields the best results. Through a long evolution of trying to control insect pests, entomologists and other scientists that manage other pest groups have adopted a rather universal approach that is called Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. The goal of this lecture is to acquaint you with the terminology and approaches we use to manage pests in our landscapes compared to field crop systems where IPM was first developed. People often claim that they want to eradicate or exterminate a pest. Eradication means to completely eliminate the pests so that they are no longer present. Extermination is just a similar term that simply means to kill all the pests. You can readily understand the futility of using such terms when you consider that many residential exterminators try to sell you monthly treatments. If they really exterminated the pests, why do they come back every month? The term pest control also suggests that we humans have complete control over a pest and its activities. In reality, we perform certain tasks that can lower or change pest populations, usually in a temporary manner. More recently, folks have begun to banter about the term sustainable environments. The idea is to create environments that don't need additional inputs. This sounds great, but it isn't very practical in our highly modified human environments that includes landscape plants planted in artificial arrangements and turf grass. IPM was developed in traditional crop systems such as grain crops, fruits, and vegetables. In these systems, we are generally growing a monoculture of a single plant. The approach is then to sample the pests that occur in these crops from the beginning to near the end of the crop cycle. For each pest and each crop, scientific studies are needed to determine the relationship of pest damage and resulting crop loss. When a certain pest population causes crop losses that are equal to the cost of control, we call this the economic injury level. However, we don't want to reach the economic injury level, as we not only have loss of the crop's value, but we still have to pay for the controls. So, if we go back and look at the pest population growth, there is usually a point where the pest population hasn't caused economic damage, but if left alone, the population will continue to grow and reach the economic injury level. This lower level is called the economic threshold level. When controls are applied at the threshold, the injury level isn't reached. In this illustrative graph, we are trying to show the relationship of a pest population to the economic injury level and the economic threshold level. When the pest population reaches the threshold, field research has found that the population will usually continue to increase, thereby causing major economic loss. So when the threshold is reached, as determined by regular sampling, control procedures are used to lower the pest population so that it doesn't significantly damage the crop. Again, further monitoring will determine if another control application is needed before the crop is harvested. Obviously, urban landscapes, which includes a wide array of trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, and turf, is not the same as an agricultural monoculture. While some would consider turfgrass to be a monoculture, it's a perennial system, not something that is planted and harvested each season. Also, notice that the managed landscapes in this image are surrounded by very diverse systems, like woodlots, roadways, and the plants in the right-of-ways and streams. Another big difference between urban ecosystems when compared to agricultural systems is that turf and ornamental plants are grown for their obvious aesthetic attributes. However, you can add to the complexity when you consider not only residential landscapes, but specialty landscapes such as business zones, rooftop gardens, and cemeteries. Another problem with urban systems is the close interactions with humans. Some people have extreme fears of anything that creeps or crawls. They just simply don't like bugs. Our other issue will be the interplay of all the kinds of plants located in close proximity to each other. As an example, Japanese beetles rarely damage an entire crop of soybeans because of the different needs of the grubs and the adult beetles. However, in urban settings, there is plenty of turf for the grubs and plenty of plants for the adults to feed on. Aphids can easily find their alternate hosts in these diverse ecosystems. If we do some simple calculations, we can see that the sheer number of plants in our urban ecosystems can be mind-boggling. In residential and urban habitats, over 100 species of plants is often the norm. And the buildings and structures themselves can harbor pests. Likewise, there are people and animals in this environment that also support pests. Even if we take a simple assumption that urban plants may have 1 to 5 pests each, we end up with having to deal with 100 to 500 pests in a complex ecosystem. If this were the case, the entire urban ecosystem appears to be entirely unmanageable when using the IPM approach. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dr. Mike Raup at the University of Maryland and his colleagues decided to see if they could solve the problem of diverse urban habitats as related to IPM. By monitoring and sampling the 100-plus plants as well as turf, they realized that only certain plants were at real risk of being killed or severely damaged by pests. They dubbed these plants key plants. Roses, flowering peach trees are 2 examples of these kinds of plants. They also came up with another concept, key pests. Key pests are the ones that often can kill or severely damage plants. We've already discussed insects like borers that can girdle a tree or shrub and immediately kill it. Defoliators of conifers can kill branches or entire plants. On the other hand, leaf aphids rarely kill plants, but their nuisance factor of dropping honeydew on sidewalks and cars is rarely tolerated. In short, by using the concepts of key plants and key pests, we can greatly simplify the urban landscape system. There are all kinds of definitions used to characterize IPM. I like this one for its simplicity. Basically because it states that IPM is a decision-making process, that it uses biological, chemical, and cultural tactics while keeping an eye on the economic costs of these tactics, their impact on the environment, and the wishes, desires, and needs of humans. We can certainly use this concept in our dealings with complex urban landscapes. Let's take a closer look at the IPM approach. Sometimes it's easier to see what something isn't rather than trying to define what it is. IPM is not just a biological control program. Biological control is an important tactic, but not the only tactic. While organic products are fine, in IPM we use them only if they are an effective and economic alternative to other products. IPM's goal is not to eliminate all pesticides. However, when IPM is used, pesticide use often drops by 50 to 80%. Using control approaches other than pesticides often costs more, but in many cases these alternative techniques can cost less in the long view. Often the cost of monitoring, sampling, and making decisions offsets the cost of simply applying pesticides on a regular schedule. Thus, IPM is probably not going to be the most expensive approach, but it also won't be the least expensive approach. Probably one of the most important IPM concepts is that IPM is a decision-making process. Decisions are made as the growing season progresses. The tactics we use should be changed to react to pest populations. IPM also doesn't just rely on the direct costs of products. Ecological costs and sociological costs are also considered. If a certain pesticide is likely to threaten an endangered species or will eliminate important biological controls, other control approaches should be preferred. Decisions are made according to constant monitoring and sampling of the pest populations. And practitioners of IPM need to resist the temptation of using the easiest and least expensive control option. All pest management options need to be continuously considered. I find it interesting that most of the terms currently used in pest management come from the Second World War period. This is most likely because the terms used in war and our battles with insects, weeds, and animal pests are similar. On the other hand, it may be due to the fact that most of the scientists who developed IPM had experienced the Second World War. In any case, we can review these terms and see how they are used. Tolerance is always an option. You don't have to do something just because you saw a pest. In fact, it may be good to tolerate certain pests because their populations will better support natural controls that need a few of the insects for food. We have already talked about eradication, and other than a few situations, usually with invasive pests, we talk about management instead. Prevention is trying to manage the pests in order to prevent their damage. Curative controls are applied after some damage has occurred and can be tolerated. Suppression recognizes the idea of keeping pests at low levels but not trying to completely eliminate them. As you can see, we seem to be using battle terms again. In this case, we often categorize different tactics or control procedures that are used to manage insect pests. Chemical control is simply using pesticides, but it can also include repellents and attractants. Biological control is the use of predators, parasites, and pathogens or lethal diseases. Cultural control is modifying the habitat so that it is less suitable for the pests. Mechanical and physical control is using traps or crushing or swatting the pests. We know that certain plants seem to be more resistant to pests, and with molecular techniques we can now insert resistant genes into plants so that they can resist pest attack. Genetic control techniques have generally involved the sterile male method. In this case, we target pests that only mate once. If we can rear the insects and sterilize the males, usually by radiation treatment, when the females mate with these males, their eggs won't develop. Modern genetic techniques involve genetic engineering methods. Behavioral control often uses pheromones and traps. Regulatory control is simply adopting rules that prohibit movement of infested soil, plants, or crops. And quarantines are a common regulatory control method. If we graphically illustrate IPM, we can overlay the three main pest management tactics: chemical, biological, and cultural controls. In principle, all three should be considered equally. However, in practice, some tactics are always used more than others. Here is my interpretation of what is currently used in landscape pest management, including weeds, insects, and diseases. In this case, pesticide application is still the dominant tactic used, and biological controls are rarely, if ever, used. I've actually given quite a bit of credit to cultural control, which includes selection of the plants used and the maintenance procedures we use, such as fertilization, watering, and mowing. This represents a potential goal in urban landscape IPM. It may never be reached, but looking at this concept, we can decide where to put our future research efforts. In this concept, we would spend a bit more time monitoring the pests and making ongoing decisions as to what should be done. We would also use more cultural control techniques, where we utilize more resistant or tolerant plants and utilize our inputs of water and fertilizer in a manner so as to minimize the adverse impacts of pests. More biological controls could be conserved and even introduced. In many cases, simply conserving what we already have in the system by minimizing the use of pesticides that kill off beneficial predators and parasites and providing habitats for these beneficials is all that's needed. In the remaining modules, we'll discuss the nature and use of insecticides used to control landscape pests. We'll also cover how to effectively use these tools. There are numerous natural and biological controls that exist in our urban landscapes, and simply knowing what they are and something about their biology can be the key to their success. We'll also discuss the use of cultural and mechanical controls. Of course, deciding which tactic or tactics are to be used should be based on efficient detection and monitoring techniques.